Having just retired, he's got options,
He does.
and you can call it an official work trip.
Hey, absolutely. Hey everyone, welcome and thanks to everyone joining us today. I have looked forward to Steven Johnson's presentation ever since he said yes to participating in Photo Plus Expo Live. My name's Veronica Cotter. I am the Education Development and Western Region Sales Manager for Hahnemühle USA, based in Los Angeles. I want to thank Emerald Expo, especially Nita, for helping with this event today. Thanks to Carol Boss with Hahnemühle USA for organizing the many details involved with these presentations. My colleague, Kevin Graham, Eastern Region and Canadian Sales Manager, will be in the chat to answer your questions about Hahnemühle papers and accessories. I encourage you to submit questions for Steven. We will hold the questions until the end because we want to make sure he has enough time for his presentation. I could spend the next hour or so telling you about Steven Johnson, but I'm going to touch on a few highlights because I want to make sure he has enough time for his presentation. I actually don't know how long I've known Steven, but it seems like forever. His work is both distinctive and iconic. His focus is landscape projects exploring wild, endangered spaces and human-altered lands. His images depict a respect for the land and celebrates our relationship with nature. His work on environmental issues began in 1972 with his work for the California Coastal Initiative. Steven Johnson is a photographer, designer, and educator. He was the curator, editor, and designer for At Mono Lake, a book and National Endowment for the Arts funded exhibition, which toured the United States from 80 to 83. He was the co-creator of the Great Central Valley Project, which eventually turned into a book, The Great Central Valley, California's Heartland, published in 1993. Since 1989, Steven's photographic work has explored computers as new photographic and design tools, refining digital photography and empowering individual artists to use these tools to express their ideas. He was recognized by Apple Computer in 1987 with a ColorSync Profiling Excellence Award. Folio magazine declared the publication of his digital photographs in Life magazine to be one of the top 15 critical events in magazine publishing in the 20th century. In 2003, Steven was inducted into the Photoshop Hall of Fame and was named a Canon Explorer of Light in 2006. His work has graced numerous magazine and book covers, perhaps most notably from a personal perspective. Penguin Books used a series of his work on new editions of one of his favorite authors, Wallace Stegner. Of extreme significance, Steven worked closely with the Hahnemühle Mill to develop museum etching paper, which has long been on my short list of favorite papers. There is so much more to share about Steven's work, accomplishments, awards, exhibitions, books, etc. I encourage everyone to visit his website, and we will include a link in the chat. Before I turn it over to Steven, I want to share an interesting insight from Why I Am a Photographer, which is on his website. In the early 90s, he was asked what he would rather be doing. His response, orbiting Jupiter with an 8x10 camera. So I'm glad he isn't in orbit, but rather joining us today. So it's my huge privilege and delight to welcome Steven Johnson. Thank you, Steven.
Thank you, Veronica. Can you imagine being in orbit around Jupiter and getting to photograph at your leisure?
Amazing.
Pretty awesome to be able to see the photographs coming back from the Perseverance.
Yeah, absolutely.
Every time I log onto the site, I see something new. Here's a new panoramic I just stitched together from two of their color images from the mass camera on the Perseverance rover. And you know, the color in Mars is a little strange, especially trying to decide how far they've taken the color interpretation. So I decided a black and white was more appropriate, and then I liked the tonality of it, and it became this silvery print and just fit perfectly with all of my photographic prejudices. So There's now
And
a
I
40.
think you can never go wrong with black and white. Just saying.
Yeah, unless the color is important. You know, I
True.
always tell people it probably needs to be a black and white.
Mhm.
A lot of people don't understand that most of my career that people have seen has been color work, but my love of black and white has never diminished in the least. So should I just plunge right in here and
Go
get
for it.
started on the lecture? Let's see if I can get this all working just right. I hope you can, oh, I have to share my screen before I do that, don't I? So let's get back to Zoom. Share the screen. And at that point, I hope you can get the Zoom. I hope you can see the screen okay. Can you?
Yep, I can.
Okay, cool. Well, the idea of printing now has sort of devolved as it's evolved. We've gotten far more people looking at images virtually than we have them making prints. Yet for me, the printing is still the final manifestation of the print that makes the image real. So in a sense, we in the digital age, or even going back to the silver age with negatives especially, photographs were sort of in an ephemeral state. They weren't quite real for me as a negative, despite the fact they were fixed physically. They weren't real until I had the print in my hand. And that's equally true now, except actually it's even more true now because the virtual nature of a digital file is such that it really is an ephemeral image. It is sort of in the vapor somewhere, even if it's electrons shooting its magnetic charges from a hard drive or SSD or whatever. That idea of the print as that manifestation of your aspirations for the photograph, fixing the image into a tangible object is part of why I call this print or this talk In Search of the Sacred Print. That idea of something physically that you can hold, touch, keep, hopefully invest in, and then pass on that investment are all part of the reason that printing remains so important to me. But it also is something that I think is terribly important in this digital age, in that it's something you can see over time with no technology other than your eyes and the physical print. So in that sense, it does become an archive of our work, unlike anything else. For me, the goals in printing have always remained the same. Beauty is the point of departure that makes me want to make a photograph. And although perfection might always be my goal, I know I've never achieved anything perfect, but I keep trying. And it's more a thrust in a direction rather than it is a endpoint. For me, wanting these prints to be purchased and invested in and passed on, longevity is very important, but it would be important to me personally just because I want my work to last. And that's been important to me since the very beginning of this digital printing age and continues to be of prime concern. And it's also true that printing can be really joyous and it can be really painful. This slide that I'm showing right now is something that I use in my printing classes all the time. But this idea of the print as a sacred object made me think about wanting to go back in time and look at how we've looked at artwork. And, you know, early on, it was looked at in a very different way than we've come to look at artwork now. Literally massive displays of multiple images, not really treating the individual image as something that is unique, special, and sacred on its own, but part of a continuum of what people saw. That salon style kind of display was very common in the 19th century and before. And you know, photography getting accepted as an art form deserves, Alfred Stieglitz deserves a lot of credit for that with the American Place and the camera work publications. And it seemed like a nice transition to go from this multiple image kind of gallery display to a photograph Ansel Adams made of Stieglitz in his gallery and office, an American Place, on one of Ansel's subsequent visits to his initial ones to see Stieglitz. He made this in 1940. And you can see Stieglitz off to the right. And suddenly the way the prints are being displayed have an individual respect, space, and ability for somebody to walk in front of them and study them as individual objects. And that was a real transition from how things had been seen previously, and photography particularly. That idea of the photograph as a precious object is something that evolved over time. And eventually it started to evolve into a kind of preciousness about the care one can bring to a print, not unlike other printmaking kind of artistic endeavors. And so this whole notion of the fine art print was born, where it is both a term of some affectation, I suppose, but it is also a suggestion that here is the best rendition of the image possible. This is the craft, the highest craft I can bring to bear. I'm willing to do the hard work to make it just the best image it can possibly be. And I suppose by implication, something that I made, although that's not always true in terms of other artists not making their own prints. But for me, that's part of the definition of a fine art print of Steven Johnson's, and that it's something I made. And that there's relatively few in number, even if it's not formally a limited edition. That idea of the fine art print also, for me, implies that I've edited this into a fully finished file, creating what I call my master archive, which has all of the data preserved and is one of a few versions. The version that I consider the master that is most digitally immune from software changes is going to be a flattened 16-bit TIFF, but I'll save a Photoshop file with layers that has all of the editing sequences in it, and then I'll start deriving out JPEG versions for the web. All of these are going to go into a folder where this precious image is treated with the kind of same respect that my prints are. And for me, that idea of the digital file being edited to that point is also part of the legacy that the print delivers, except it may or may not be readable after I'm gone, or even into old age. I'm going to make every effort that it is. But that idea of the fine art print, again, to return to that concept, it implies a care throughout the whole process, the craft brought to editing, something you've proofed, examined, reworked if needed, reproofed, and maybe reworked. It's like a rinse and wash repeatedly, repeat as needed. And that's kind of what the idea of a fine art print is. You work it until it's done, almost regardless of the amount of work it takes, into as near a perfect rendition as possible. And that whole idea of fine art printing is a craft. It's a craft that can be learned. In a sense, it's something separate from the vision that it takes to make a photograph worth putting this kind of effort into. But this idea of craft and vision get really kind of firmly linked in the sense, because the vision itself can be cultivated by asking the most you can possibly ask out of the print. And so they become kind of inextricably intertwined as well. But I do think of them a little bit differently in the sense that when I'm trying to envision the photograph, when I'm out making the photograph, I'm trying to imagine what the photograph would look like. And there is some pre-visualization aspects a la the zone system of imagining that as a print. But for me, the first question in terms of imagining what the final print might be is going to be asking myself the question, what was there? Am I capturing what I'm seeing? Because that is the ethic and the aesthetic I bring to my photographic world. I'm completely seduced by the beauty of the natural world, and my best photographic aspirations seem to be deeply involved in trying to hold on to a photographic impression of that, which for me also goes to the very heart of what I think photography's greatest power is, and that's its ability to tell a visual truth that is kind of unparalleled in any other medium. So I'm looking at what's the tone range in the image. Am I capturing it with the histogram that I can see on the back of the camera? What sort of tone depth might be needed in the final image? What kind of color needs might be there in terms of color balance, saturation, hue distinction? Do I need to make sure I photograph a color checker passport at the same time because the color is strange and I want to have that as an insurance policy to make sure I can decode that color? And then when I'm starting to edit the file and all of these considerations are coming to bear on the transition from raw to processed and interpreted image, I'm also looking at whether or not the image was sharp to begin with and what sort of optical illusions I might need to create for the print, so-called digital sharpening, which of course isn't sharpening at all. It's just an edge contrast exaggeration, an optical illusion we create in the file. I never want to depend upon an after-the-fact digital sharpening of the data to make for a focused image. I want that to come out of the camera the best I can deliver optically to the sensor. And you know, that hue distinction can sometimes be critical because if I can't see minor differences in the hue of a color, I may have the photograph lost entirely. And this photograph from the Kenai Fjords Exit Glacier that I made with the Better Light digital scanning back in the mid-1990s is a good example where if this image is off balance in its editing or its printing at all, very subtle distinctions between cyan, blue, almost emerald, and sapphire gets lost completely. And so thinking about how I envision the photograph linked to how I envision the print all become part of the same matrix of considerations that photographs might demand different kinds of attention to that detail, but that's the kind of detail I tend to try and bring. And of course, when I'm starting to think about a print, I'm thinking about, well, for me, that would be one of two general looks and feel, kind of a gelatin silver kind of look coming out of that black and white darkroom experience, whether it's color or black and white, or whether I want to take advantage of this beautiful new possibility that we've had now for the last 30 years of being able to print directly onto a more apparently uncoated cotton paper, much like a beautiful printmaking paper that a lithographer might use, which is sort of the genesis of the museum etching paper that I'll be talking about later too. And when I'm making the photograph, I'm thinking about the size that I want it to be. Am I capturing enough data? Do I need to actually stitch together images to make for a higher resolution image? And ultimately, the considerations you have about where this particular print's going to be shown. Is it going to be in heavy light, high humidity, subject to abuse, or will it be able to exist in a gallery kind of situations where it's got all the protections we would hope a print to have? But it's also true that we not only have new materials we can use, but this whole idea of digital files and the kind of depth of detail and tonality that we can capture, for me, it's just enabled all sorts of things with regards to color accuracy, realistic tonality, kind of a restrained color palette that isn't dependent upon a lot of saturation and actually can carry with it a very good rendition of what my eyes experience. Certainly not all of the dynamic range and depth of color that my eyes can see, but a good enough representation of that I feel like I've got enormous opportunities to try and make a strong photograph. And we've got nuances of detail and highlights nowadays that we simply never had with film because of the characteristic curved shoulder kind of flattening out of highlight and, for that matter, shadow detail. And the digital file contains enormous amounts of highlight information that I really do love being able to count on. And of course, now that we're in an age where digital editing and printing is so deeply embedded in our workflows, I go back to what I can do in Photoshop just to fine tune an image. And I try and imagine Steve's brain 30 or 40 years ago thinking about the darkroom and trying to burn something in just right, thinking that I could make a local selection and tweak the contrast a little bit just to make it a little less visible or more visible. Those kinds of controls and possibilities would have been unimaginable in the darkroom, yet they were definitely things I would have appreciated even then, as I would have had a hard time believing it would be in my hands. And of course, the whole idea of editing, especially in Photoshop with adjustment layers, is you can do an iterative editing of building up your interpretation of the image
and continue to be able to tweak relationships between these things. And as you make that print, interact with the files so that that idea of the fine art print becomes an interpretive journey that you're going through, where you look at the best representation of your so-called final edit, and you look at it and say, well, yeah, but that shadow really is getting too dark and featureless. I need to go back into Photoshop, select that area, and just make it give it a little bit more presence in the image, taking the idea that we had of burning and dodging and putting it on some sort of nuclear steroids in terms of capabilities. So I'm excited to be printing now. Every time I want to make a print, I try to appreciate the power that is now in my hands and think back to the evolution of all of this. And of course, William Henry Fox Talbot really created the metaphors in the 1830s about how we think of making photographs today, where he was exposing coated paper in his camera, coming up with a paper negative, and then contact printing that into another piece of coated paper, making a positive. In fact, Fox Talbot really invented photography more like we see it than Niepce or Daguerre in many ways, even though Niepce was making photographs, I think, a little bit before Fox Talbot, but there's some lack of being sure about some of those things. But there's another thing about Fox Talbot that I always have appreciated. He made the first photographic book of a collection of prints called The Pencil of Nature in 1844, about a 6x9-inch book, of which I think there were about 23 original salted print positive paper prints. So my hat's off to you, William Henry Fox Talbot, and all that you gave us in photography. And given that, I couldn't help but put in a slide about a contact printing frame for one of our heroes in terms of the silver-based age of photography. This is one that the Photographer's Formulary sells, where we now may or may not have a film-based original going into a piece of silver-based paper. We might have a digital inkjet negative going on top of a piece of gum bichromate paper or platinum paper or inkjet that's already been printed that you've now put an emulsion on top of. So the possibilities are just enormous nowadays. And the fact that I still need my contact printing frames is, I think, a testament to the fact that it's all part of a continuum for me, which of course continued into the darkroom. This is a photograph from the 1930s of a darkroom being prepared for a whole celebration in San Francisco. A quick snapshot that I'll get rid of quickly of my now rather messy darkroom in the process of transformation from a bad water leak to, of course, nowadays, an inkjet, which is, this is my Canon ImagePrograph Pro 4000, which is my main go-to printer these days, although I still use my Canon 8400 and 6450 and the Pro 1000 desktop printers. Printing as a timeline for me started back in 1970, literally a friend from high school who had made a darkroom under the stairs of his house and invited me in and showed me how to develop film and make little prints. It wasn't until a few years later that I was in a college AV lab doing black and white printing in a black and white class, and in the AV lab copying and developing Ektachrome E4 color slide copies. Of course, I built my own darkroom, which turned into a color darkroom. But in the mid 1980s, I started having experience with my first digital editing, where we went into a digital prepress house, had something scanned by what was a photomultiplier tube drum scanner, and was on my first Cytex retouching station to take out some of the pencil marks on my wife Mary's wild alphabet poster that we were doing for her at the time. It wasn't too long before that turned into digital prepress work for my Mona Lake work, which got me in touch with Kodak and Adobe and Apple. And pretty soon I was working with Kodak on their dye sublimation printers, which turned into some consulting with Leaf Systems on their digital camera backs. And by the time I started my National Parks project in 1994, it wasn't long before we were making prints with the Iris and then HP inkjet printers and then Epson inkjets, and then helping HP to actually design their Z-series self-profiling printers working with them in Barcelona. And I've been working with Canon inkjets ever since. But I couldn't help but share with you this little video, which I hope the sounds comes through
Photo
okay.
has been prepared for printing. It is sent on disc to the Digital Pond print shop in San Francisco. An Iris Color inkjet printer produces the large format output. At this point, Steve can inspect and make changes to the print just as he would in a lab. While the availability of electronic tools makes it easy to transform the original image, Steve Johnson prefers a cautious approach.
So that was from the Digital Pond in 1995 on their big printer. Wasn't too long before I had my own Iris in my own lab making my own prints. Which brings me to a video that ABC, actually this was the one we did for Apple, it's called A Photographer's Journey.
Printing is also rather phenomenal. The darkroom experience was always burdened by such a distance from the experience of making the photograph, and a lot of that has been shifted up front. So a lot of what I would have done in the darkroom later, I'm now doing on site when I care the most about the photograph. So the act of printing now is done in the light, not in the dark. And I kind of like that because the whole subject matter of photography is light. And I'm in the light when I'm printing now. That's the way it should be. For my final prints, I'm using an Iris Realist printer on watercolor paper. And I'm using an Apple core technology called ColorSync to color manage the transform from my original red, green, blue files to the Iris on rag paper. And I'm 95% of the way there with my first print.
Now, of course, I wasn't making prints out of the back of my van as a normal course of my workflow, but that idea of being in the light rather than under a safe light or other kinds of real dark for color print situations did have kind of a liberating quality to it that I continue to enjoy today. So I'm going to go through a few gallery displays. This is my, not the current exhibits, but my hallway gallery on the bottom and my main gallery that you see me sitting in now with originally the National Parks works in both. And of course, galleries take on the meaning depending on where you have an opportunity to display prints. A few years ago, I had an opportunity to create a gallery on a cruise ship going to Antarctica, and I took advantage of that. And the installation photographs that I make along the way are designed to sort of document the exhibits for sure, and you'll see a few here. But sometimes they're also about trying to show the scale of the prints. And I wish I had somebody else to stand in the photograph sometimes because I'm damn sick of seeing me, but I'm handy. And so trying to communicate the size of this Mount St. Helens photograph. My friend Bobby Lane made this photograph of me in the hallway gallery for the Exquisite Earth show. For the Lifeform work, the gallery I'm currently sitting in, this was a local photographer that was doing a magazine profile on me. And I definitely wanted to show how big I was making some of these prints from the Lifeform work. And at the same time, when I decided to do a whole exhibit on 50 years of space photography, seemed like a good idea to document the size of those prints as well. But I do take photographs of prints and me just to show simply the scale, regardless of whether an installation. When I was doing a concept proving of making big prints from this Lifeform work that I started in 2013, it was important for me to document the kind of prints I was going to make, both to show some potential sponsors and supporters, as well as Canon, for example, when they decided to put a lot of prints in their booth and help sponsor the project. And when I was going to make the space prints, I had to show what I had in mind to do. And I remember the day that I made the first of the big prints from the Lifeform work, I was so amazed that it held up to a large print that I immediately had my assistant go out, make a photograph of me holding the print up and then used it as a way of showing how this show and body of work was evolving. In that case, I made this big print, and the next day I had a business appointment coming over, and much to my surprise, just in casual conversation, I brought up I just made this first big print. The fellow that saw it bought it on the spot. That's the first biggest sale I've ever had of a print so quickly after I made it. The next day I had a $4,000 print sale after I made the print. That's the kind of work I would like to be doing all of the time. But I do think it's important to show your work, and I've shown it in trade shows. This was a premiere or preview showing of the National Parks Project with a new eye at the Siebold Seminars in, it's hard to say what year this was, about 1998 probably. A more local review at a place called the Image Flow up in Marin County, showing some of the national parks work just a few years ago. And unfortunately, I just got notice that they're going to be closing in July, and I'm very sad about that. This was the Canon Trade Show exhibit a couple of years ago at the Javits Center in New York City, which was the first public showing of this life form work, which then went on to have to be framed and matted for the whole show and open in Sacramento at the Viewpoint Photographic Arts Center, and a few installation photographs from that particular showing. And then here we are in the gallery I'm sitting in now, showing the life form installation of 26 big 50-inch prints, which then led me to think, as that was up and they were looking so bizarre, exotic, and kind of alien, maybe it was a good time to change the hallway gallery into a celebration of the 50th anniversary of the moon landing in 2019, which birthed the otherworldly commingling of 50 years of space photography and the life form show that you see documented here. But I can tell you, I've had some experiences over the years that continue to blow my mind, like when the National Parks exhibit took over the Kilkenny Castle long gallery, 13th century castle. And this is one of the installation shots from 1996. And you know, if you go back to the idea of that print as a tangible object, once you fix it, you can also sell it, obviously, you can display it, but you can also gift it. And one of the things we wanted to do after 9/11 was take this panoramic that I had done in 1997, and actually when I was back east for the Photo Plus show, and actually we contacted the mayor's office here in San Francisco, Willie Brown, and Michael Bloomberg's office in New York, because we wanted to make an official gift from the city of San Francisco to the city of New York of this panoramic print. And here I am formally giving it to Willie Brown. And again, that physical object I could make, print with pigments, really carefully frame it, mat it, and then we went to New York and presented it to the city of New York. And you know, the things you can do with your prints have a lot of meaning for me. Certainly, I was able to donate big prints of my rock and roll photographs to the Bridge School benefit that Neil Young gave with his friends and his wife Peggy, who really organized it, being the co-founders of the Bridge School for Handicapped Kids. And it was great to be able to donate prints every year to the kids raffle for many years. And it was a thrill to see my prints up on stage and have people bid on them, but it was even more fulfilling just to know that it's a way of trying to make a difference.
Hey,
and that's what I've always, yes.
Stephen, I just wanted to, first of all, comment on that image of Lower Manhattan. You talked about the power of the print, and it evokes memories so often. And when I was first working in the photo industry, I worked in the World Trade Center. So that part of New York has a special connection for me. And also this gives me the opportunity to let you know we have just under 30 minutes left. We might be able to add a couple extra minutes, but just a time check.
Well, I'm only a little more than a third of the way through, so I'll keep that.
Okay, I'm going to just bow out now here.
Oh, no, that's okay, Veronica. I'm watching the time. So anyway, using prints to try and make a difference is what was done when Carlton Watkins prints of Yosemite, the big 18 by 22-inch glass plate contact prints onto albumin paper, were brought back to Washington, D.C. in 1864 and shown to members of the U.S. Congress and to President Lincoln himself, which led to the Yosemite Act in 1864. In that tradition, when the Mono Lake National Scenic Area was coming up as a bill in Congress, I took photographs from that Mono Lake exhibit back to Washington, D.C., and we created a temporary exhibit in the Senate Office Building Rotunda and literally lobbied office to office with a portfolio of prints that I kept carrying around. Sometimes you got to build special things. When I started making digital panoramics in 1995, making these long 27-foot long prints created their own installation challenges. Here's one we did in 1998, I think, for the Javits Center, Photo Plus again, in the Adobe booth, a kind of walk-in spiral panorama. The first one we did, we literally hung from wood on ropes and I think taped it to a big circular piece of foam core at the digital pond where they helped me laminate it. And eventually I built a special walk-in panoramic room where you could be surrounded by it in my previous gallery. So I use photographs to promote the prints, sort of a circle as well. So I made 3 photographs, 3 finished prints in a single day last fall, which led me to go ahead and think, well, I need to photograph those 3 prints. Of course, I only had 1 easel, so I had to photograph them 3 times and composite this together. But nonetheless, it got the 3 prints up and people could see it. And then I thought, well, why don't I just put a display out, especially during the pandemic, so that I've got the light on the timer and people can even see through my front door at night to see the newest print illuminated. Obviously, when we're looking at prints, we're looking at them under controlled lighting condition. We're talking about them in teaching situations. That idea of evaluating the success of the prints is part of what we do all the time, whether it's for students or friends, or whether it's building an exhibit or teaching a class. Always looking, trying to ascertain whether this is the best print possible. And in a gallery situation that's open to the public, it's almost the best of all worlds because you've got the prints on the wall, people can see, and your life's work becomes shared experiences. And that's incredibly fulfilling. And I'm always bringing a tube full of big prints as I travel about. This is at the LA Center for Photography, where I did a lecture many years ago for that fine, fine institution. And literally holding up big prints that I brought down rolled. Or at the community college in Maryland, in Rockville, doing a lecture in their theater and bringing along prints where, yeah, the prints aren't very big in this case, but people just come to the front of the stage and we talk about them and show them. Or when you get some potential buyers, you definitely want to take them through some of the portfolios. Or a lecture in the Canon booth, again, at Photo Plus many years ago, where I was talking about copying negatives with the camera. And so I showed a big print of George Harrison from a negative I made in 1974 that literally I took a picture of rather than scanned. And this was to sort of prove that you could really get pretty high quality out of these 50 megapixel or more cameras. Of course, I also used prints to curate the exhibits. Literally, the Exquisite Earth show took shape from my preconceptions and then my working prints on the floor, on paper, going back in, finding new prints, printing them, seeing how they worked in the sequence. When we were putting together the life form portfolio, literally I took all of the proof prints and risked laying them down on the carpet just so I could get a picture for a buyer of the portfolio that was essentially commissioning the creation of the portfolio, to help me choose which photographs to put in the portfolio, because it seemed as though he ought to get that input. Occasionally, you've got a bad print, and no matter how big it is, you need to get rid of it. And so in this case, tearing one into little pieces, this was the first tear. It seemed like I should show that. So there's all sorts of technical things I could talk about. I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. But gallery display considerations are way in my mind all the time, especially the color temperature of the displaying lights, because that often means you're under low voltage tungsten lighting that is very yellow. And jewelry stores usually have better lighting than galleries, but both for levels of illumination requirements, as sometimes galleries have, they keep the lights low. Gradually, we're getting them to switch to at least 5,000 Kelvin lighting, which is more of a bluish daylight kind of color. You've got to be aware of reflections off of your material and ascertain the viewing distance for the size of the prints. Those are all things that play into it. Of course, as you're processing and doing the image editing, I encourage you to really follow your own unique vision rather than preconceptions. Like you hear people say, well, the first thing you do is establish a black and white point in an edit. I think that's nonsense. You should look at what you think your memory demands and your photographic aesthetics demand. And for me, that goes back to what was there. And in terms of making sure I encode the detail into RAW, I'm always thinking about how I'm going to be able to interpret that data for finishing in Photoshop. And for me, that's about realism, not about hyperbole. And I really do like big prints. They have to be permanent and they have to have durability. So as I plunge into more technical stuff, I would encourage people to edit and print in a neutral workspace, put a neutral gray desktop, get a neutral shirt on. This sort of bluish green would not be okay for editing because it does reflect back into the screen. Make sure your ambient light is controlled and that your computer monitor dominates, but not so much that you've got real vision adjustment just being in the space. And you want a viewing light that's the same color as the white point you've calibrated the monitor to. Now I'm going to have to go through the printing software pretty quickly because this isn't really a how to print class, but I'm usually using the dedicated driver from Canon or Epson, and I'm using that in a custom profiled workflow. I do also use the image print rip, and I'll mention that a little bit later in black and white. The connections in printing are multifaceted. You have to go from the software you intend to print from, and for me, that's always Photoshop, not a raw processor like Lightroom. You're then connecting to the operating system, which for me is the Macintosh, and then the printer software that the manufacturer supplies. And that connection can be complicated, and it takes some while to get those connections straight sometimes. It's part of what we do in the classes. And although some of these slides are a little old for printers I don't usually use, it does get at the fact that in Photoshop, I have to choose the paper and where it's going to go. But then I also have to make sure I know how the profile was made so that the quality of the image can come through with the exact same kind of printing conditions. In this case, the media type that I made for when I profiled the paper to begin with. And in this case, you see the Mount St. Helen image all ready to print, but this Lifeform image shows you that I always use Photoshop to manage the color. I'm using a custom profile that I created, and I'm using, for the most part, a relative colorimetric starting point, although my inclination is a perceptual rendering. And of course, that's off subject to what we can do in this particular time frame. I do continue to do tests where I'm printing the letter size piece of paper through the printer multiple times, so I get little small tests. And then if I have to tweak things, I can tweak them on the small prints before I go to 8x10s. And if the color is a little bit off, that means I have to take care of it by editing the image a little bit before it goes back out through the printing process. And if it's got a green cast, I'm going to add a little magenta. For black and white, the advent of gray inks into the printing sets really gave us a whole other set of possibilities. And for me, I'm looking for neutrality in the black and whites, just like I would have in the darkroom. And we've got ink sets now that have a lot of gray inks in them from Canon, Epson, and HP. John Cohn has had his piezography inks for a long time. And having a knowledge of how to use the printers to really tap those gray inks means that you really need to remember that if you're using a profiled workflow, you're not going to have any direct ability to tap those gray inks under most scenarios. You have to use the printer driver color management so that you can have the printer driver tap those grays in their black and white modes that you see here for Canon, or the black and white mode you see for Epson. And if I'm really serious about getting the absolute best black and white I can, I'm probably going to go to the image print RIP, which really has taken low-level control of both Epson and Canon printers and given us a level of neutrality like we've never had. But of course, maybe not on the black and white, but in color, that means I'm really working color management, where I've got the file coming in from the raw data that I'm interpreting in the raw processor, then opening it into Adobe Photoshop. Let me do that again, so that it opens with precise numbers in the file, now that every pixel has a meaning, which means through a calibrated monitor, Photoshop can throw the image up through the display profile. And then when I get ready to print, go through the printer profile, which is the destination space, which should mean, if things are working well, that in the calibrated viewing light, on a calibrated monitor, your print should look an awful lot like your image on the screen. And of course, my last book, Steven Johnson on Digital Photography, goes through this quite a bit. And you can download the color management chapter on my website for free. But that does mean at some point, somebody has made a profile of that printer. And here you see us using the i1 spectrophotometer with the i1 profiler software to take a profiling target and measure it into a printer profile, which then again can make for a print that is a really good match to the piece of paper and the image on the screen. Meaning also, of course, that your print viewing light needs to be the same color as the white of the monitor so that the whites have a chance of matching, which means that monitor match and the viewing light, in my case, are both going to be set for 6,500 Kelvin. Those viewing lights can be a challenge in and of themselves, both for print inspection and hopefully in the gallery. I still use in the gallery Graytag Macbeth sole source lighting because I use a tungsten bulb heavily filtered into the blue to achieve a color temperature that I like that is not unlike the black line of sunlight that you see in this graphic. But I do use compact fluorescent bulbs as well, although you see the spectrums are very different, even if they have a peak RGB value that's similar to daylight. And I'm experimenting more and more with LED lights now as well. The print qualities that we now have options for are just kind of amazing, both with a whole wide variety of media, including different kinds of photographic looks like resin-coated paper like a luster, or a more gelatin silver kind of look like the Hahnemühle Photorag Pearl, and the cotton papers like the museum etching. And I'm going to have to skip a few slides here. But going directly to that idea of longevity involves using pigment rather than dye, acid-free paper, no optical brighteners like this bluing agent you see here, which are often added to papers to give them an ultraviolet bluish white boost. Turns out they're not stable themselves and they can affect the fading of the pigment inks themselves. Stable storage and low light except when you need exhibition. I'm using cotton papers as one of my favorite things. The Hahnemühle Museum etching is my paper of choice. A lot of companies make these all cotton printmaking kind of papers, but I also want a gelatin silver kind of looking paper. And for me, that's the Hahnemühle Photorag Pearl. So these are my two favorite papers. Of course, I do end up milking the old inkjet cartridges, so I've got some ink to spot back with later. I do spray my all cotton prints to try and protect them and minimize linting, as well as make a custom print label and provenance stamp for the back of every print. And I'm running out of time here. I'm going to go 1 or 2 more minutes on print presentation. And although I wish I would have had time to show you more work, you'll see a few more images here in this little slideshow. It should be playing now, and there it goes. I'll let 2 or 3 go by before I move on. These are from my National Parks project. That's Denali in Alaska, a silver-based negative. That was my first image of a landscape that I was proud of with the digital scanning back of the Fitzgerald Marine Reserve. I do portfolios as well, and I do installation photographs of the portfolios so that they can be presented on the web in a form that people can see. So just a series of photographs going through the portfolio so people can get an idea virtually of what the portfolio consists of. Of course, the portfolios are for sale, and that can make a good part of the income over time. The Exquisite Earth portfolio is another one that, well, that was supposed to be a slideshow too. Maybe it was going to start on its own. Let's see. Well, I'm not going to worry about it. Portfolios can have all sorts of forms, and there it goes, including folio kinds of portfolios, special projects, boxed prints. When we did a whole bound set of prints from the National Parks Project, we did a whole set of big sheets of paper, getting them down to something we then cut and bound into a book. And I am going to have to skip ahead here to allow time for questions. So I just quit the slideshow for a moment so that I could go forward with a tiny bit on the museum etching paper, which is a paper I wanted to help create because it was the paper I wanted, low lint, all cotton, a rough surface, but not too rough. And we ended up working with Hahnemühle to create that paper in a way that I was very happy with. So we've seen these slides. Let me go beyond them. And I wanted to wrap up the talk a little bit because I love Vincent's work so much. I love this quote, even though maybe it isn't at the heart of what my work is, but I always say the world is already self-embellished. It doesn't need enhancement, even though as a painter, he was suggesting he wanted to exaggerate what he saw. For me, I want to record what I see. We do a monthly newsletter that you can subscribe to if you like. And I do a whole series of photography workshops, of which are all virtual, except toward the end of the year, we're going to start doing in-person workshops, again, field workshops with vaccinated students, hopefully. And I have a full digital printing virtual class coming up in early June. So there's the website, stephenjohnson.photography, and a resources page. And Veronica, I think I can quit the slideshow, stop sharing my screen, and let's see if there's any questions. Did I get away with getting it all?
I'm sure everyone was like me. I've got, pages and notes here. There were some questions. Patrick wanted to know, has Lightroom arrived yet as a viable alternative to Photoshop?
Oh, God, no. In fact, I argued against Lightroom even having the capability to make a print because I said people will be printing unfinished images. And I saw the quality of printmaking fall dramatically as more and more people started using Lightroom as an end product. It's a great raw processor. It's a good image database, but the kind of fine tuning you can do in Photoshop is what I need as a photographer. And why wait all these decades and careers, years, to have the access to the tools I have in Photoshop and then just use a raw processor on them? It just doesn't make any sense. I think of it as a raw processor is designed to pull out the raw data. Photoshop is designed to edit that rendered data. So I use Adobe Camera Raw rather than Lightroom, and I just use Bridge as my image viewing software.
Excellent. Andrew wants to know, how do you flatten roll paper? Obviously, you're working with a wide format.
Oh, the D-roller.
That thing is, I knew you were going to say that. That thing is great.
I forget how many years I've had it now, for a long time, probably well more than a decade and a half. It's this little pipe with this Mylar roll of plastic around it. It's basically a way of reverse rolling your rolled print. It's completely non-destructive to the print. It lets me not have to use my big vacuum press to flatten anything. It's an ingenious device, the D-roller.
And you look at it and you think, really? This simple thing? But it works.
Especially for the price. But
It
yes,
works. Someone asked, and someone actually made a great comment. It was Constance. Maybe there could be another presentation to include what we skipped over. There's never enough time, and it always leaves room for, okay, what are we going to talk about the next time? So Constance, stay tuned. We'll see what
Well,
we can do.
and this wasn't designed to be a technical talk. I just felt like I had to do some of the technical stuff.
There was a question early on about why a Canon printer, and I would think you're a Canon Explorer of Light. So from capture to print, it's Canon. Plus, it's a good printer. I mean, we have the Pro 1000 here at home, and we love it. But I'll let
Well,
you.
frankly, that's not the reason, though, Veronica.
Ah.
For many years, under contract with Canon, they were encouraging us to start using their printers. And to keep a longer story shorter, I said, I've got plenty of printers. I helped design the HP printers. They're still my best printers. I worked with Epson on the development of their pigment. I got plenty of printers. And they said, well, you should buy one and try it out. I said, well, send one in and I'll try it. Eventually, they decided to send one in. They had gone to a fairly sophisticated printer by then. And most of the things that I had seen that were less impressive to me really had been into the past. The real frustration with the piezography printers like Epson is the tendency for the heads to clog, and that has not stopped. One of the real advantages of the thermal printers like HP and Canon is that use heat to push the ink through the printhead, and that tends to keep the printheads much cleaner than just the pressure of a piezo crystal pump for the inkjet. And so I came to my Canon printers because of the Canon image quality and the reliability and the printhead for the matte black and the photo black. And I so rarely have a printhead clog now. It's unbelievable. And my Epson printers have suffered from that. And so I love Epson. I'm grateful for everything they've done for us for the advance of the pigments. They were really, really good to work with me on the development of the pigment printers. And I'm so grateful for their presence in the industry. But I'm using Canon almost exclusively now. But I keep my Epson printers running, and I keep my HP DesignJet 3200 running as well.
Well, that was informative. I kind of made an assumption, and goes to show, never make an
So
assumption.
if they had insisted that I use the Canon printer, I would have resigned from the program. It's just that simple.
And we have just a couple minutes left. I'm going to ask a question, and it's kind of like lightning round. It's a quick. It needs to be kind of quick.
Any speed you like, Veronica.
Yeah, that's right. How do you know when a project's finished? I mean,
when you've committed to a date to ship it out the door in some fashion.
Okay.
Either to a publisher or a gallery or to a buyer. You do your best. You can keep tweaking with things. I can't imagine what a painter must feel, because they can always add paint to the painting. And I was married to a painter, and then had a girlfriend that was a painter for many, many years as well. I know how it can be endless, but by the same token, as a photographer, you can do that as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's finished when I feel like I'm being inspired by the print I've been able to make. And I can't think of any way to make it better.
Okay.
Now, it may be 10 years from now, the technology's improved, my own Photoshop skills have improved, and I may come back and be able to make a better print 10 years from now. But these prints behind me on the wall in the gallery, I don't go around looking at them and think they could be better prints. I might look at some of the images and say, I could have done a better job making the image. But at some point, you've got to put that endless perfectionism in some sort of, it can be a motivator to get you to work hard, but it can kill you at the same time. So you've got to allow yourself to finish things and show them and ship them and sell them and exhibit them, or you'll be in an endless, never-ending loop of self-dialogues. And that's, who wants that?
Yep. Well, I guess that's encouraging words and a good place to end. And thank you so much. And I look forward to when I can travel up the coast to truly one of my favorite parts of Northern California and Pacifica. And thanks for putting aside the time to join us. And to everybody out there, we've got another presentation next month on June 28th with Sandro Miller. So stay tuned. There's more.
Well,
Stephen,
the gallery is now open for appointment with people that are masked, socially distanced, 2 at a time, preferably vaccinated as well. But the workshops will require vaccination when we start doing those in person.
excellent. That was one of my questions. If people made an appointment, could they visit the gallery?
Yeah, as long as it's 2 people and they're masked, and then I will stay away from you great distances unless you're vaccinated as well.
And
But
I
yeah,
encourage everybody out there to go.
Oh, yeah, thank you very much, Veronica. There's nothing like having people see the work. If nothing else, you got to come see these this 100-inch Mars panoramic I just made for the 50 years of space photography exhibit. But yeah, I want you to see my work as well, not just the things I print that NASA did the work to create. So
Hey,
yeah, please do.
Hey,
Please do.
Stephen, somebody was asking for the URL on that slide. Can you quickly just tell us what they are?
The one for the resources page is sjphoto.com/resources.html. And my new website is stephenjohnson.photography. And if anybody emails me, I'll be glad to email that stuff back to you.
Cool. Thank you so much. All right.
And
Well,
thanks to Hanamula, Veronica, thanks to Jorg Adamant and Martin and all those people that worked with me and gave me that wonderful tour in Einbeck. And the trust they had in my judgment to make the museum etching paper was just amazing. I remember Jorg said to me when they were about to make the run, Steve, are you really sure that people are going to love this paper? And I did have that moment of hesitation because they had to make tons of it to go online with it. And I said, yeah, I'm sure. And
Well,
it turned out really well.
it did, and it's one of our best-selling papers. And as I said, it's long been on my short list. So
Who gets to print on the paper they helped design? I mean, I feel so privileged, So
it's beautiful. It has a real refined surface to it. We could go on and on about papers, but thanks to all. Have a great Friday and a wonderful weekend.